Thank you very much for coming back. Let's start. I'm not sure whether there's still a lot of colleagues around the coffee area, but I'm sure they'll join us very soon. I have the pleasure now to moderate the second session. It'll be a hard act to follow the excellent first panel, but we really look forward to having another group of really excellent speakers here with us today. And what we want to do in the second panel is really pick up a little bit on a few points that were already raised in the first ones and hopefully take us a step further in two ways. One is to really dig a little bit deeper into some of the data gaps that we mentioned, but also look at some of the promising emerging approaches of filling these data gaps and looking at different ways in which this data can then be used. As we mentioned in the first session already, there are different data needs for different purposes, and we want to dig together into this a little bit deeper with the panel. And then what we also want to do is reflect a bit upon this data use. What are the ways when we then when we use the data in a different way that then feeds back into the way we collect data. What happens in high-risk contexts, in contexts with vulnerable children and young people? What does that mean then for the data collection methods? And what does it mean then also for the clarity that we have to have in our minds as to why we even collect this type of data? So we have really a number of interesting insights here. We've got a great panel to join us, but before I introduced them, I wanted to just very quickly go to the room and see who we have here today. Because usually, for the grid presentations and grid launches and our conferences, we have a great mix of people and great mix of different types of institutions. And just to get a bit of a sense of who we have, so we can refer back also to you in our discussions and make sure when we talk about data use that we know what are you using data for? And we want to also invite you to really talk to us a little bit about what you use the data for, that we all collectively produce and the type of evidence we produce, but also what you, again, think is missing. So we mentioned missing data gaps earlier, but let's talk about what's missing for you, really, in your work here in Geneva or in countries and in operations. So maybe just very quickly, I wanted to do this with the Slido, but chickened out at the last minute because I was freaking out about the technology. So therefore, maybe just a show of hands. Who's here working with a UN agency? I start with the UN because Geneva is a hub for many, many UN agencies, as we all know. Okay, quite a number of colleagues with UN agencies. Who's here representing a country in some shape or form? State, institution, government? Similar number, even more. Thank you very much. Who's here representing civil society in the widest sense? NGO, advocacy agency. And now you can also put up your hand if you're at the same time doing research and academia, maybe within an NGO style or university. Less so, that's surprising, good. But I know that some of you have double hats on, and that's really great. Because we will also be talking about connecting, making sure that the data that's generated is then actually used for different types of policy purposes, operational purposes, planning, etc. So thanks a lot for showing who you are and what you may be able to get out of this conversation. We'll then see. I first start now with introducing the panel briefly. And then we'll go through two sets, in a sense, of contributions from them. We'll then open back up to you and then see where that conversation takes us. All right, let's see. Today we have here Amélie Gagnon with us from UNESCO. And Amélie, you already contributed to the first panel discussion, so you've already been heard. And she works with the IIEP, the International Institute for Education Planning, and has the title Senior Program Specialist. And behind that, though, hides some really exciting work that she does and leads, and she'll tell us more about that in a second. She'll kick us off today. Then we have William Lowe from Save the Children, and William also and colleagues of his work on exciting, really cutting-edge analysis, taking us into the realm of predictive analytics, to see where are children across the globe at risk, not just of displacement, but of being affected by climate change and other types of risks. And he'll tell us a little bit about that work, but then also, because that's his forte really, he will tell us about, again, the use of that type of analysis in global policy processes and other types of discussions. After that, we will then have Corina, who kindly stepped in, Corina Demotas from GIPS, who kindly stepped in for Margarita Lundqvist, who was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately is sick. And GIPS, as you probably all know, has a lot of experience of collecting data in protracted displacement situations, doing collaborative profiling exercises. And Corina will share with us a little bit the lessons learned from this that are relevant to this discussion, and particular also lessons on the limits or limitations maybe of the type of data that we can collect through profiling, but also through other types of data collection methods. And again, this question of data use is something that she will critically reflect on. And then last but not least, we have Shannon here, not just from IOM, but IOM and UNICEF. And Shannon leads a really exciting initiative. It's DTM, the Displacement Tracking Matrix for Children on the Move. And you'll tell us more about that, but also again with this bigger framing of, do we know what the data that we're collecting is being used for, and then what does that mean for how we collect the data? So I'm really excited that you could all come here in person. All of these excellent panelists have been also contributing authors to our report, and we're really happy therefore that you're here to join us live and tell us more about your work. So, Amélie, maybe I can just ask you to kick us off. You have a really interesting new approach to assessing not just where people may be at risk of displacement, but who they are, where they are, and with a particular focus on children and young people. So therefore, kick us off. Thank you. Yeah, you just have to start speaking.
Speak? Now, great. Excellent. So thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. At IIP, I lead a small team, the development team. And our role really is to create tools, very simple tools that are really data simple, data light, that are all developed in free open source software and data where available, and also with free literature, free access literature, so that anyone, anywhere can actually do what we do, replicate what we do with very low minimum barriers. And so over the last 18 months, we've been developing a series of tools that really draw on the power of geospatial data to improve the efficiency of educational planning, but also, as we hope, to unlock some of the bottlenecks that we have in educational planning, but also in other areas that we're all concerned with here, well, delivering education to as many people as possible. And so, as you might know, IIP has been involved in the EIE, or Education in Emergencies, or Crisis-Sensitive Planning for decades. And one thing that we realized, brainstorming or talking about it in different forums with colleagues of IDMC and others, is that our collective capacity to improve our understanding of the demographic profiles of displaced people inter-ally is not evolving pretty much. We're trying, you're developing really cutting-edge approaches to do so. But one thing that we wanted to work on was really about being able to identify the profiles, because if you want to plan education, deliver education services, deliver any type of response, you need to know who's there. And what we realized from searching the existing methodologies that we could find was that when we try to find the sex disaggregation or age disaggregation of displaced people or people on the move, it's very difficult, because all the methodologies are trying to do so after a disaster, after a conflict. All the methodologies that we can find also have very wide age groups, sometimes very different age groups, depending on the data collection. And these age groups are very little relevant to education. So, I mean, you can really hardly deliver education services if your target population is 0-18, right? You would need to know a bit more who you're talking to make sure that you not only provide the right services, but that you actually allocate efficiently your very tiny resources. And so, it's difficult to do so because the scale that you need to work with is really small. It's micro-level data estimation. And it's very difficult also because people are already on the move, and observers can just observe as much as they can. And so we needed to kind of shift the paradigm, shift the perspective. And that's why we decided to propose a methodology that would look at the population distribution and their profiles before a disaster. And so building on open access data, open and free software, we designed this methodology last October that allows anyone to actually disaggregate the population for any territory by single years of age, and then rebuild age groups that are relevant for the intervention. And so, for example, here, ta-da, we can see that we built this visualization showing the density of the pre-primary school-age population in one province of Madagascar that has been affected by cyclone Batserai very recently. And so, with our method, we can build the specific age group 3 to 5 for education in that province. We can build primary age group 6 to 11, 6 to 12, whatever your context is, because this is so flexible, you can customize it as you want. Secondary age, school age population. And then what we want from that approach, I mean, this is great for planning education in normal times, let's say. But when there's a disaster, and we're focusing here on natural hazards, the idea is that how can we look at people where they were and now estimate who will be exposed to a natural risk or a natural event that will probably push them to be displaced. And so what we do, this is just mashing up all the school-age population that you saw before. And then we use UNOSAT, again, open access to their satellite observation, their satellite imagery, where they detect, in this case here, floods. So basically, by combining the different layers of population by educational level with UNOSAT imagery, where we can actually use this imagery as kind of a cookie cutter to identify which population is within these flooded areas, we added a 1K buffer just to make sure that we can, capture the event properly. And so this way, we can basically just go back behind the image. There's a lot of data, and then create statistics that tells us what's the proportion of girls, of boys, what's their age, and where they're located. So if you are from a NGO, you're the government, from an agency, whoever, you can actually not only allocate your resources by educational level, but also by location. And so I think that this method really kind of increased the capacity of anyone, literally, to make, rapid and perhaps finer decisions. Now, our approach is not meant to replace everything that we've been doing so far. As we put in the background paper, is really to help triangulate and to help perhaps better locate the needs. But the idea is really to also join every colleague that is trying to get a better sense of who's being displaced and how can we provide a better response. So for IDMC, that could mean better estimates. For anyone else working in countries or with relief agencies, would be to better target and better estimate the actual population that are there. So as I mentioned, everything is in free access, free everything, free to use and free to customize. And so we're happy that we could contribute to a background paper in this report this year. So please let us know or connect if we can help you using this approach. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Amélie, and thank you for, in a sense, already halfway taking us to where then my question would have been in terms of the use of this type of data, because it struck me as quite impressive is that your approach, because it can go so granular and it is based on where available, I understand, also locally available data and not just estimates, that this is really information that can be used, as you said, by IDMC for better estimates at the more national or global level even, but also for almost local planning, right? So really...
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you an idea, these estimates can be produced at the 100 square meter level. So it means that it's like in this room is a bit more than 400 square meters. So in this room, you would have enough information to have like 4 little pixels and actually draw the information at this level of granularity. So of course it's not perfect. If you have census data, you can use that. If you have World Pup producing estimates for you, that's also another source. Anything is valid. And I guess my approach is also to say that even if it's not perfect data, at least we have something to build on, and so to triangulate, as I mentioned. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, and from what we can see and can tell, give you as feedback, obviously it already goes quite a step forward and beyond what is usually used. And that would, I would like to connect that in a sense directly to what will be talking about a little bit. Because this is really, as I mentioned already, quite a cutting-edge research also that's been done and new methods on trying to assess children at risk, not just of disasters, but also of the impacts of climate change. And I'm just now thinking what could be done potentially, and maybe we can later discuss that, what could be done with the type of analysis that you've developed, then inputting this type of information. And again, you know, for then being able to use that at different levels of planning. So maybe we can go straight, before we then open up a little bit, go straight to you just telling us a little bit more about the predictive displacement project with predictive analytics. But it's an initiative by Save the Children, and I think 2 reports were published that also referred to the methodology last year. So we don't want to go into too much technical detail here, but maybe you can give us a little bit of insight on what it is, and also, you know, what the implications are and what the results can tell us. Thank you.
Sure. So actually, I thought I'd talk about a couple of areas that were covered in the background report, and predictive analytics is one of them. So the first is child-focused research, which is these adapted tools and approaches that speak directly to and draw from children. So we found this incredibly valuable for kind of developing our understanding. So we did a report recently, Climate Change, Induced Child Migration and Displacement. We spoke directly to about 240 children, and it really highlighted just how dramatic the impact of climate change already is on them. I mean, even just physiologically speaking, they're so much more vulnerable to malnutrition, to infections and diseases, and sensitive to heat and respiratory kind of ailments, all these things that go hand in hand with climate change. And it's also really evident already that these things are driving conversations and decisions around mobility with or without parental consent. We know that to have effective policy and programs, we need to have a nuanced understanding of the drivers and the decision-making behind migration and displacement. And really, the only way to get that in the sufficient level of detail in this space is talking directly to children. And then something that in one of the talks this morning, I think Enzo was talking about it, the importance of this intersectional thinking. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Children aren't this homogeneous group that you can just talk to as an entirely representative way. So there are different vulnerabilities in different kind of slices of that population. So children with disabilities, boys and girls, LGBT children. And unfortunately, you can't just talk to children and then talk to people with disabilities, because if children with disabilities have unique vulnerabilities and issues that you'll miss if you just talk to those 2 kind of slices. You need to then talk to children with disabilities to understand their actual situation. So, yeah, if you'll forgive the shift in focus, I also wanted to talk about SAVE's increasing investment in predictive analytics as a way to extract as much value as possible from data as it becomes available. So predictive analytics is now incredibly commonplace in other sectors, marketing and pandemics, but is kind of gaining ground in the humanitarian space. And so our work includes, anyhow, avoiding too much technical detail, includes kind of traditional machine learning, so about using big data to make predictions about displacement flows between countries. We can ask, when do we think a displacement is likely to occur? How big is it going to get? What are those flows going to look like? And those kind of answers are really useful for strategic planning, for prioritization, and conversations with donors and governments. But then we also have these really new types of modeling, like agent-based models, where instead you build the model based on the decision logic and the patterns of behavior that people exhibit in these situations. and then you zoom out from the individual level to the country or the region, and you run a simulation based on how people react when you introduce a conflict or a climate change pressure. And this is really exciting and interesting because it allows you to actually predict the movement of people across a travel network, to see where the weight of arrivals will fall and the kind of timeline that you would expect them to arrive in. So this is a huge potential benefit to operational level response. And all this stuff is really exciting, and it's really exciting to be working on, but it needs data. It needs good data to get good results, good predictions. And historically in the humanitarian sector, our data is, in comparison to other spaces, it's messy, it's incomplete, methodologies have changed over time, and disaggregation of data is weak, as we've talked about. For Save the Children, unsurprisingly, age is our big focus. Whenever we make a prediction about how the scale of a population, we need to be able to say within that population how many are children, so that we're ready to respond. So it's really exciting that there is this increased focus now on disaggregation and on demographics. So I'm thinking of things like the founding of the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, which we lead a working group in. Investing in data now is going to pay these huge dividends later, and we also need to develop the skills in our organizations to kind of work with data in this way, which is often easier said than done because, frankly, there already aren't enough data scientists to go around. But that's a whole another conversation and challenges. I'll leave it there, but just to say, so yeah, child-focused research and predictive analytics, we're kind of two different ways that we're kind of approaching and using to increase the representation of children in data.
That's great. Thank you very much, William. And thank you also for really, again, taking us that step forward, further than just saying, yes, it's exciting work, because of course there are limitations, as we all know. And there's been a lot of investment and talk about, and it's got a lot of attention, I think, not just risk assessments, but predictive analytics as an overarching term. And, normal people like me start, banding around terms like machine learning and natural language processing without exactly knowing what it means. But also, I think sometimes maybe without exactly knowing how we then, again, can use this type of information. So maybe we can just, because there's already so much information in these two presentations, which are showing promising new approaches, but just open it up very briefly to all of you. If you have questions on the types of approaches that were presented, but maybe also with a question in mind that, in a sense, Verena kicked us off with this morning. If we think about our own children or children in our families and circles of friends, they're all so different. So how do we actually get, their specific needs and aspirations then, again, even if we have age disaggregated data, into these types of models, if we're on the one hand thinking big data, big estimates, but yet we know we also need a more nuanced understanding. That's one kind of big question that I have in mind, but maybe there are others. Would anyone like to come in at this stage and ask these two panelists a question? Yep. And please, like in the morning, introduce yourself and just ask the question.
Sure. So my name's Alex Jackson. I'm the ICRC's Global Advisor on Child Protection. And I would like to thank the organisers. I think this is a very useful and interesting report, which we follow every year with a lot of focus on the different data and trends that you draw out. And I think the panel this morning is very interesting for us in terms of operations. So, for example, the ICRC works specifically on family separation, prevention of family separation, and then the unaccompanied minors. And what I would like to really hear from you is kind of how you look at the nuances within displacement, because depending on different conflict situations, it's not always the same patterns. You might have younger children that are sent ahead, you might have girls that displace, you might have boys that displace to avoid recruitment, and how, if at all, you're able to draw out any of those kind of patterns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Are there any other questions right away. I think before I go back to Amélie or Will, I think it's also important to say that the analysis that you're doing is not necessarily in conflict context, right? Increasingly, one can probably apply it to assessing disaster risk and climate impacts in fragile and conflict situations, but that's not been at the core of the methodology as I understand. But maybe you want to say a few words, Amélie,
Yeah,
or
no,
one
thanks.
could still maybe address.
Yeah. Two great questions. Maybe this is maybe the easier one. For now, we kind of use this model only for natural hazards because for two reasons mostly. Or maybe I can add a third related to the report because IDMC shows that 90%-ish of all displacement is due to natural hazards. So that's kind of an incentive also to use the model this way. One other reason is that with satellite imagery or Earth observation or detection of certain phenomenon, natural hazards are, I would like to say, easier to locate in a sense. Of course, when I saw the first maps of the recent events in Ukraine, beyond the shock, initial shock, of course, thinking about the Ukrainians, of course, we were tempted to use this model with the maps that were produced by the different agencies. But we don't go as far right now because I think that conflict might be a bit more elusive and it might be less useful actually for response because active conflicts, I mean, are not a place to, add noise, let's say. So that's why we focus on natural hazards right now. Now for your point, it's, I mean, I guess you're already kind of tackling the next steps, right? Like how to even better understand the profiles of the children. I guess from our perspective, at least, the first roadblock was really about knowing, like, estimating an average or like some idea of the age so that we can have an approximation of the educational level in which these youth or children are. And then, of course, we can go forward and look at, household survey, look at the language profile, look at the disability profiles and statistics. I mean, each of these data points, each of these characteristics are a world by themselves, and that on which some of our colleagues even are working to create and support governments in creating better statistics. So I guess, yeah, I guess the long term is what you're describing, and I hope that we can contribute to this discussion. Thank you.
Will, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So I think we have actually put quite a bit of time into conflict as well as kind of natural disasters, which is often an easier starting point. And absolutely, when we approach it from a modeling perspective, we have a kind of a baseline model that we begin with, and then we work in the throughout the duration of the conflict, as long as we're trying to model it, to refine it and to keep refining it. And Ukraine is a great example because men staying behind, you've got a completely different population profile as your kind of output of who's crossing the border. Entirely different to, say, what we were seeing in Tigray, which is one of our kind of big sandbox environments. So that's our kind of process. And we know from the very beginning when we start offering predictions, we're like, look, these numbers are wrong. We know these numbers are wrong, and over time they'll get less wrong. And this is about decision support. We're not trying to create a kind of a perfect version of reality from the very beginning, and we have to be very open about that. So yeah, every instance it's going to be a case of, these predictive products, these approaches, they're not going to work off the shelf. They need to be refined. You need to have the team. You need to have the specialization there to do that, to work with these products. And then just something else that you made me think of is that also increasingly drawing a hard line between conflict and climate change is getting fuzzier. It's getting fuzzier and fuzzier. And it's something right now we're increasingly spending our time trying to figure out what that relationship looks like and how we're going to try and represent that in things like these models and in data, because it's really complicated. And I think we're still relatively early in that process of trying to work out how to quantify and understand that relationship between those two things, which are really overlapping more and more every day.
Thank you very much, and indeed, thank you for reminding us of saying that we like to use in IDMCs, like all models are wrong, but some are useful, and I think that's definitely the case, regardless of whether it's really modeling disaster-related risks or conflict, and conflict is even more complex often, at least on the hazard side to model, right? But I think that point that you raised there is really an important one, and one that maybe I'll now abuse the power of being the moderator here to switch around our panelists, and thank you, Shannon, for agreeing to that. And sorry, Karina, you'll go one after then, because actually we've been really struck by the approach of the DTM for children on the move that doesn't answer your question in a way, but goes in that direction and actually looks at, some of how do we tackle this noise, and in particular amongst groups where we don't even often are equipped, as we discussed in the first panel, or don't know even how to approach, communicate properly, find the right spaces to do so, and then and are not clear in then how we manage that whole process, right? From data collection to then informing potentially models and then in decisions. So Shannon, thank you so much for just jumping in here now and maybe sharing a little bit about the experience of the DTM for Children on the Move.
Yes, sure. It's working. Okay. So the project DTM for Children on the Move was started between the UNICEF's cluster-led child protection area of responsibility. So I know that sometimes people are not familiar with that name. You might call it the child protection subcluster in the field. And IOM's displacement tracking matrix. And what we wanted to look at is how can we better use data that's already being collected for strategic decision making. And I think what's key here is that we need to remember what the purpose is of the cluster system. We're not there to do research. We're not there to figure out the specificities for program implementation or for budgets. Our goal is to help our partners prioritize where they need to work in a big country. So for example, in Ethiopia, we've got between the IDP sites and the returnee sites, there's 3,000 locations. Where do we need to work? Because we can't implement child protection measures everywhere. We need to know what types of response is needed and who are the vulnerable groups. And so in order to do that, we first need to acknowledge some of the challenges that the protection sector faces, and I extend beyond child protection to include GBV and protection in this. And the challenge that we have is proving the problem. And so if you look at the humanitarian sectors that provide basic needs, for them proving the problem is quite straightforward. For food security, for example, you can prove whether or not food is available. You can do a household assessment to see if there's access issues. You can find out how much people are eating and whether or not they have the appropriate diversity of food. For water, you can find out if there's enough water, if it's contaminated, do people have access to the water? But when you're thinking about child protection, the problems are things like, and I've written them down, so many, dangers and injuries, physical and emotional abuse, gender-based violence, mental health and trauma, children associated with armed groups, child labor, unaccompanied minors. So proving the problem, it's a massive scope. And I know that if any of you have ever tried to explain what protection is to one of your friends, it's really, really hard because it's such a big scope, right? So where do we go with this? The second challenge is that a lot of the problems that we're supposed to be proving in order to obtain funding, for example, are often hidden and taboo. We can't go house to house asking someone if they're abusing their children. Firstly, the data will not be accurate because it's underreported. Secondly, there are serious ethical considerations that need to be done, and that we cannot get that data anywhere. We cannot get that data. If I went to a police department here or to a child protection specialist here in Geneva and I said, how many children are survivors of gender-based violence, they would say, I know how many are reported, but I don't know how many are unreported. So collecting that data is absolutely useless. So what do we do? The solution that we came up with is what the Child Protection Area Responsibility calls the Needs Identification and Analysis approach. And the approach is to better use existing data to stop doing very costly and lengthy child protection assessments. We can find out what we need to do with the data that already exists. And the approach acknowledges that we don't need to know the prevalence of certain child protection incidences, especially the ones that are underreported, in order to make strategic decisions. And so what we do is that we start with what's the decision that we want to make. Because oftentimes our colleagues get lost in trying to prove the problem and they end up collecting data that they then don't use. So for example, okay, I've collected data on the prevalence of child labor. And if I say to them, okay, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to put those families in touch with the food security colleagues so they can integrate those families into livelihoods programming? Well, no. Okay, well, what are you going to do with it? And so if we start from the decisions, such as where do I need to prioritize case management services in this emergency, and then outline what data we require, whether or not any of it exists, and then work that way, we end up making much better use of the data that we have. The second thing that we do is that we stop trying to prove those unprovable things, the hidden taboo subjects that don't give us reliable data and could do harm. What we do instead is that we could do something as simple as like a focus group discussion, a couple focus group discussions, speak with some child protection experts from the country to understand what the underlying factors are that drive child protection issues. And some of them are obvious, you know, if there's landmines or conflict or, you know, there's displacement, which can lead to child separation. Other things might be a bit more nuanced and more contextual. For example, how does food insecurity impact the decisions that families make that can then hurt children? Do they take them out of school and ask them to work? Are they being exploited? Is there more family abuse because of stress in the family, that type of thing. And so what we do is that we measure, instead of trying to measure the child protection issue, we measure the living conditions and the situational factors that lead to higher child protection issues. And this is aligned with how the IASC basically recommends in their guideline on integrating GBV into emergencies that we look at those situational factors instead of trying to prove the problem. And that will help us to know, okay, we know that there's a lot of displacement here, food insecurity here, and the water is far away. We know that there is definitely going to be more child protection incidents here. So, given that, we then look at, are there already response services? If there's already response services, then we don't work there. And so we look at those things, the underlying factors and the response services, in order to figure out where to prioritize our work. And so in answer to your question on the unaccompanied minors, for the cluster level, we would not be looking specifically for the number of unaccompanied minors, because a lot of the time, even with households data or key informant data, we won't have a good scope on the exact number of children, because especially key informants don't interview all of the children. They actually need to go through a case management process. But to understand the dynamics of what's going on, I would suggest probably a focus group discussion or speaking with a child protection specialist from the country. And finally, the approach also looks at recognizing that there is different data for different purposes. So you can't just use data from one data collection methodology to answer all of your questions. Household interviews are great for when you need to understand what proportion of the IDP population are experiencing a specific challenge or need. But you would not necessarily go to all these different households just to find out where your services are mapped and how far away they are, right? Do I need to collect data on child marriage when I already have census data on the fact that children are being married in this country? And so the approach also challenges us to question, do I really need this? What decision is it going to help me to make, and does the data already exist?
Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you for really, in a sense, telling us that despite a lot of the data gaps that we already identified, coming back to what Christelle said earlier, a lot of data is there, but let's find the smart people who are there to connect then the dots and actually do the analysis based on that. But I think also importantly, what you raised there in terms of the different types of tools that we need in different types of contexts, and often in one context for one purpose, even combine the different tools and work via proxies, particularly in these high-risk and vulnerable contexts and situations. And there, before we then open back up, I'd like to invite you now, Corina, because GIPS, of course, has experience of 20 years almost now, 15 years approximately, of collecting data through collaborative profiling exercises in particular protracted displacement situations, and has really a number of lessons to share here, I think, in terms of, again, coming back a little bit to what Shannon was saying, what type of data can we get from the usual assessments, from from focus group discussions, but also this bigger question that you have raised in your background paper to the global report as to the limitations of the type of data that we currently collect. There's a strong focus, and we at IDMC bang on about it all the time, that we need more disaggregated data. But there's also even limitations to that, because of course that doesn't necessarily, just because we have disaggregated data for a specific situation, doesn't necessarily mean then that those people that are represented in the data are then, in a sense, better served. Maybe over to you for some lessons on that.
Thank you very much, Bina, and everyone. Maybe before jumping into the proper conversation of our contribution, the background paper and the discussion, just one thing I find really interesting to observe here is how, the lady over there made this morning the comment around that there are lots of different conversations going on, but we need to actually connect them. And what I see here with the panel discussion is that there are already pathways and promising kind of avenues of connecting those conversations, and I think that's really, really interesting to see. So we'd like, from GIPS's perspective, we'd like to nuance the conversation a little bit. It's, we broadly agree disaggregation is really important. It's really important to make sure that that children are reflected in the analysis that's being produced, that they're made visible in the data, just as other types of maybe subgroups of internally displaced people. So disaggregated data is really important. It's critical. It's critical to deliver on some of the global engagements, such as Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 Agenda, and other policy and global engagements. In some cases, it might not be telling enough, about the actual situation on the ground, about the intentions, the perspectives, and the experiences of the people the data tries to, and the analysis tries to provide information about. And, the background paper that we produced really puts forward two key messages, two key angles, where we observe these limitations in the collaborative profiling exercises that we support in GIPS across the different contexts across the world. And one limitation is really linked to the methodology design, the technical aspects of a profiling exercise, of a data collection exercise, more broadly speaking. So here, not only limiting it to profiling. The second bit is about the process. So let me maybe dive into each of those two dimensions a little bit more. And we've had some of that this morning a little bit with Enzo, that I see sitting over there, and some of the other colleagues, Alexi and others, in the conversation this morning. So really, it really resonated with me and with what we see in the exercises we support. So looking at the methodology design, the technical aspects of a data collection exercise, there might be a standard definition around who is a youth, who is a child, what are the age groups that we apply. And in the specific case of the background paper, we really refer to an exercise we recently supported in Sudan, large-scale durable solutions analysis implemented under the Peace Building Fund in close collaboration and leadership with UNHCR and the Durable Solutions Working Group members. So in Sudan, to give that concrete example of the issues we see around definitions, is that in Sudan there is actually a different definition that prevails around who is a youth, and it's actually not the standard age group of 15 to 24 years, but in Sudan someone is considered young until 35 years old. And in fact, in the quantitative analysis, we based the analysis, or the exercise that we supported as GIPS with partners in country, the analysis was based on the standard definition of 15 to 24 years. However, during the qualitative analysis, based on focus group discussions, etc., we found out that in Sudan, a different definition applied. So in the quantitative analysis, it means we missed out on some of the granularity we could have captured otherwise, had we been aware of this contextual element. But in the qualitative analysis, we then found out, what that meant. We found out that 1/3 of the internally displaced in Darfur, in the localities that were analyzed, were actually, so 1 in 3 were actually youth. And youth were considered, generally speaking, as unexperienced and thus excluded from decision-making. So from processes, political processes, peace-building processes, they were excluded from those, although they had played a really, and continue to play a really strong role in the political situation in the country. So it's a really important insight when we talk about durable solutions and bringing about effective responses to support communities in finding solutions to their displacement. So much on definitions. We also realize, and this was touched upon today several times, who responds to who provides the data. And here, the approach often is using quantitative approaches, using having respondents at the household level, but that does not provide. It means one person will reply to the series of questions that you might have in a questionnaire. One person will reply on behalf of the whole household. And we've already heard that this will not provide the granularity that you will need to inform more tailored and nuanced responses and solutions. So here, in an ideal world, we would have an individual level response to really capture the differences in perspectives, the differences not just in profiles actually, but also in experiences and perspectives, in intentions for the future, which we often miss out on if it's just one household member responding for all the others. In the case of Sudan, again, to provide you with a tangible and concrete example, we found out during the qualitative analysis that some of the youth had actually a different shared different intentions for their future, while the majority of the IDP population that were considered, that were covered in the survey, indicated that they wanted to go back to their places of origin and access their lands there. Quite a few of the youth representatives actually responded that they would have a preference for staying and locally integrating, because they considered that the access they had in the place of displacement was perceived as better than in the place of origin. So that really came through the qualitative analysis, the qualitative component. We would not have been aware of this nuance had we only relied on the quantitative part. And also in terms of methodology design, one more bit around the qualitative information. In the case of Sudan, we conducted community sessions to validate the analysis. So we had a preliminary analysis, we had a joint analysis process with the different partners in country, but we then also involved communities and different community representatives, in this case making sure that we had both women and men included, but also within each group, different age groups. So also youth, but also elderly people included in the community sessions to discuss the findings and then analyze, do they actually agree on the findings, do they identify with it, and also understand their priorities in terms of what are their perceived key obstacles to solutions. And that was really, really telling, because some of the things we were able to nuance and to adjust from, so some of the insights from the quantitative component really we were able to validate, but then also to prioritize those obstacles together with the communities. Which leads me to the last, the second key point, so aside from the methodology design, which might impact, what you can actually get out of disaggregated data, and whatnot, where those limitations are. There's also the process component, and we've had today a little bit about this morning with Enzo around the meaningful participation, and this very much reflects our insights on community engagement as well. There are different levels of engagement. There are different ways of engaging. When it comes to data processes, it's really important to have. It's critical to engage also those parts of the community, such as youth, throughout the process, throughout the data process, from the outset, from the moment you design your methodology, which would allow you to ensure that your definition of youth, your definition of the internally displaced population, it would allow you to contextualize and make sure that you consider cultural differences, you consider local perspectives, but then also later on in the analysis stage, so making sure that your analysis reflects well the perceived realities of the internally displaced and different subgroups within the community, and then allow them to participate in the decision making that they have a stake in. So allow them to actually become data users and not just beneficiaries, but actually data users, expanding, we had this morning, expanding their agency in the data processes, and not just in the in the responses themselves, but as early as when those responses are being informed. So really ensuring their agency within that process already to make sure that they can already take an active role in the action planning bit, in the way the data and the insights inform actual responses. Perhaps stopping here for now and handing back over to you, Bina.
Thanks a lot, Karina, and thank you really for going straight to this whole point of how do we then go beyond not just the household level, but also beyond our preconceived definitions and concepts when we devise the research tools and the methodologies. And of course, I mean, any ethnographer or a social anthropologist in the room, I'm a social anthropologist, so it was like, we knew that all the time. Of course, we have to do that, but it's so hard to do in many institutional environments and many response environments in particular. And it's still sadly the exception rather than the rule when it comes to data collection on the ground and primary data collection. So thanks a lot for really sharing those insights as to not just the way that we then collect the data, but to reflect on how to involve people in different ways, and also in the validation then also of the analysis, something that I think that's really a key point here. And maybe just to open up the discussion a little bit further, I mean, Verena, you said you just came back from New York for the GCM, because I think it's objective one even of the GCM, one of the 4 main ones, is really to improve data on people on the move, more broadly speaking, for informed, I think it's said evidence-based policies, as we like to say, so really informed decision making. At the same time, we heard that there are conflicting obligations here of people going in and out of the room because of the World Health Assembly happening, and of course COVID over the past 2 years, and very much discussed there at the World Health Assembly, and different types of pandemics or the future of pandemics have shown really the relevance of strong or trusted and authoritative data for decision making. And this has really brought it home over the past 2 years. And yet, are we making advances? So we've heard a lot about new approaches, but we also still feel that the nuance is missing. So maybe just remembering all the hands up here in the room of government representatives, state institutions, UN agencies, what type of data are you really still missing in the work? But also questions then, in a sense, to this panel, and all of them have presented really exciting new ways of filling some of the data gaps. How can we now make sure that that type of data can be used by all of you? But in addition to that question, any other questions are welcome now as well. Verena.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the good discussion. I have 2 questions, and I just got struck by, earlier in the morning we were discussing about the meaningful engagement of young people, and we heard many examples, and now in these innovative sort of data sourcing approaches, we didn't hear much about how young people themselves are actually part. And obviously, at least I can say most young people are much savvier than I would ever be, using their own mobile phones to ground truth data, or they are actually able to say the water's contaminated. So I just wanted to ask if in these different sort of modeling processes, are we fully tapping into the capacities and contributions, and also are we offering earning opportunities to young people as sort of their own researchers and their own best experts of their community, sort of ground truthing, crowdsourcing data points. And then the second question is to you, Shannon. It's always good to hear you. And I love the work that you are doing with the DTM and Children on the Move, and obviously we're great fans of it. But I really like what you said, that are we actually, what are we looking data for? What are the decisions that we need to make? And I just wondered if there are maybe in the years of having done this work, whether some of the data that we're looking for, we're just looking because we actually need to write our humanitarian action report. But we're not actually asking data that is helping us to lead to decisions that young people or displaced people would seek. Is there some example that you could share where the decisions we need to take are completely dissociated sometimes from the data we keep on getting and writing and reporting on?
Excellent 2 questions. Do we have any other contributions? Yes, please.
So thank you very much. It's really interesting. My question is quite a rider on the last question that was asked regarding really what are we looking for, searching for the data for. And I find this, this report from evidence to impact of the IDMC mapping the next 10 years. The 4th component is talking about the road to 2030. And in my mind, I was asking the question, is it something that was specifically couched in view of the Sustainable Development Goals? I see one important component of it on the partnership. So I'm like, partnership for the SDGs, because essentially, forced migration is integrated into almost all the components, you would say, all the various 17 SDGs. And my interest lies, as to the question of how the sourcing of this evidence and data on migration, specifically, let's say displacement, for example, is also connected to the SDGs in the discourse or in the research, or the information and statistics on displacement. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any other hands up? If not right now, then let me come back a little bit to the panel. I think we've got 3 really kind of big blocks to discuss here, no? And maybe we'll start off with this really interesting question of children and young people's agency and how to not just reflect that then in the evidence that we generate, but actually how you mentioned Corinna validating data by the people themselves. So maybe you and also William, given that Save the Children is operational across so many countries on the ground, can you reflect a little bit on this question? Is there any way that we can actually also, in a sense, build on young people's entrepreneurial spirits and not just recognize agency in terms of their aspirations, but actually their skills and also rootedness within their own communities and build on that and their technological skills and give them an opportunity, in a sense, to turn this into meaningful development for themselves as well, rather than just think about always the big picture.
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea. I think, and I see it as kind of a potential evolution of some of the stuff I was talking around kind of child-focused research, that it's an opportunity to kind of expand that out. I will say also it kind of brought to mind some kind of conversations we had early this year and kind of some head-scratching kind of pontificating. We did some work with some organizations in Iraq and Jordan about it, trying to talk about what does localization look like in this kind of highly technical data space. And I think it kind of brought to mind some of those kind of questions. Like how do we meaningfully talk about localization with something that is inherently has really high barriers to entry around its kind of technical nature and its kind of resource demands? And I think we don't have the answers there yet. This technology that we're working with is absolutely increasingly democratized. It's way more accessible. It's way easier to understand and to kind of get started with it than it has been ever before, but it still remains pretty demanding. So how do we meaningfully prevent it from just becoming the exclusive domain of organizations that have the access to the kind of specialized resources it needs? And I think what we started to kind of, the road we've started to go down is to start thinking about a new kind of relationship where the people that are providing the data we need for these products, for this data, they're both the data owners, but ultimately we want them to be the end users that benefit from the products we're creating. And that's quite a new relationship in the kind of data space. And I think that's something we need to tease out further to understand how to do that, how to address questions like data ownership and responsibility in a way that's accessible and understandable and structured. I think it's a challenge we're all going to face. And yeah, we're trying to start to have those conversations now so that we don't find ourselves, in a few years' time, just really, overextended on it.
Thanks a lot. Corina, do you have an example maybe even where youth were then involved in that next step? Maybe not by connecting it directly to modeling and tech, but in any other way?
Yes, absolutely. And before getting to that example, maybe just a broader, taking a small step back to give a broader response to that as well. So we've had a lot about national ownership, around national leadership on responding to internal displacement, around localization in global processes, a lot of talk about whole of society approaches, etc. Those are all really important principles, and I think broad agreement how important they are. How do you do that in practice is exactly the key question, and in JIPS, we like to say it really starts with the data processes. It starts as a first step with the data processes and then goes beyond, obviously, but data processes are a first step to create political will, to foster national ownership and local ownership and leadership, importantly. And tapping into the expertise of what you, the question you put forward, Verena, tapping into the expertise and the capacities of youth in that sense can only happen if you work with the youth. So it really has to, what we like to call in JIPS, it has to start with collaborative leadership. And collaborative leadership means that you do work with the national entities, you work with the local actors, and among those also the communities. You work with them directly throughout that data process and then beyond. You involve them best you can in those processes. I think the question that today is key is how do we do that? And there are promising approaches. There is promising practice of doing it, but I think there's so much more we can do. And I definitely think that in the support we provide as JIPS in profiling, collaborative profiling exercises, but way beyond, as a community, there is much we can still and will need still to learn. The good news is that there are really interesting practices happening. So in the case, and here coming to the very concrete example from Sudan again. There are other examples where we have been working with youth directly or indirectly from Honduras, from other cases, other exercises we've supported. But here, coming back to the Sudan example, youth weren't necessarily involved in the methodology design, so that's something that would have been great, as we realized afterwards. They were involved in the joint analysis process, though, and that really paid off. So alongside other representatives of the community, youth were involved in community sessions that were held at the different localities that were covered in the study. And during those community sessions, they were, so it was really about validating the analysis. We presented the analysis, the key findings from the study, from the profiling, the durable solutions analysis. The tricky part there was that we had to adapt the way we presented those findings. So we had to present them in a way that the communities, the local authorities, could actually connect to them, understand what the findings meant, what they could interpret them within their context. That was the challenge. So we had community sessions to validate the findings, and then based on those key findings, also prioritize the key obstacles for solutions. So including youth, but also other representatives of the communities, different age groups that were tasked to work within two groups, men and women, to prioritize the obstacles, and based on that, then also design or draw their vision for their future. So really an exercise, and the results from those community sessions then fed directly into subsequent action planning processes, action planning workshops that were also held at the locality level that again involved youth representatives as well as local authority representatives and relevant UN agencies in each locality to jointly shape up the action plans. And here again, a lot of the some of the action points that were put forward by the youth themselves and linked to their role within the peace building process. So the role they could play to advance the progress towards peace. And that's really where it becomes very interesting, because here we see the direct link to then those action plans being able to inform local level responses that really help advance towards solutions in an effective manner. Maybe just one last comment, linking it also, one of the things we put forward as CHIPS to the, as part of the consultations that were conducted as part of the UN high-level panel, but also in our work, so not directly tying with the background paper, but broader reflections, is that you also need to link that to the national level. So you've got the local level and the role that youth can play in that regard, but you also need to bridge it to the national level and to the strategies on solutions, to the policies on internal displacement, to really make sure that the role that youth can play is reflected there as well.
Thanks. I mean, collaborative processes like that, of course, take time, but then can not just inform decision-making, but shape the whole process of decision-making, therefore the prioritization, right? So it's good to learn from that. But concretely, we don't have much time left, but I am intrigued by that question and a concrete example. You know, we do find, and also at IDMC, we constantly rack our brains how to make our evidence more policy or decision-making and operationally relevant as possible. And yet we have examples even where we know some of the ideas that we had of why we're generating data or evidence are actually far off to what's needed. So very rarely, I should say, but sometimes that's the case. So maybe can you give us an example and also how to counter that?
Thanks for that question, Verena. And it speaks very much to what William was saying earlier about, you know, information for decision support rather than collecting data to try to paint an accurate picture of what's happening in a humanitarian situation. And considering that the decisions that we're making at the cluster level are all strategic in nature, we don't need to know the rate of child labor because we don't have specific programs for children who are working. We don't need to know, do we need to know, for example, the rate of disability in a displacement context, because all of our services should be accessible for people with disabilities. We shouldn't be making them accessible only if we identify a disabled person in a specific situation. Now, this might change for the people who are actually implementing the programs on the ground because they're going to need to adjust how they do their programs in various places. But for the strategic level, that's information we don't need. Or child marriage. If we know that there is child marriage in a country, we can see the census numbers. Do we need to be going house to house asking if the children are married, and what are we going to do with that information? And the second part of this is the data that we do collect, we really need to make sure that we're keeping in mind the data collection methodology. So for example, with DTM, we do key informant interviews with people who are not experts in every geographic location of an emergency, and we might ask them, have you seen unaccompanied children? Now, keeping in mind, this is probably somebody who works for a municipality, and he's seeing kids running around, he doesn't know what's going on. If he gives a number, and we publish that number, it could really do harm in terms of funding, for example, or reputational risk. And so perhaps we'll ask that question just so that it can be a red flag to alert UNICEF to follow up to that issue in the country, but we don't want that number to be published. And this is a challenge that we often face when our colleagues in the field are asking for information, because they'll say, you know, I want to know how many people have their identity documents. And we have to go through okay, I want you to put yourself in this person's shoes. He works for municipality, 15,000 IDPs have shown up. Are you going to know what's in everyone's pockets? Right? So this is another way that we try to kind of bring it down to reality of what we can get and how we use it. Is it a red flag for follow-up? Do you need it to be published? Can it be published? Is it accurate enough?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that concrete example. And I can see Amelie wanting to barge in, so I'm going to go straight to you, over to you before we have to close up.
It's a really short and nice story to answer Verena's question and the colleague in the back. I complained this morning about, you know, data capacity, data architecture being underfunded and so forth. And one of the value we really believe in is data sovereignty. So any work we do with a country and we produce data, we make sure that the data is on or really available to the country to be used in future activities. And we work at the request of government. So ministries of education would call us. And we were working with Madagascar earlier this year. And one of the topics that we were working on was travel time to school. And this was evoked this morning also, travel time. And we have a model available if you want to use it. And to keep the model very, very light, we focus only on two values, school locations and the road network. And when we started working with this with the colleagues in Madagascar, for a specific province of Vakinan-Karatra, we realized that the road network was incomplete in the OSM database. If we were working with other data sources, we would say, oh, sorry, you don't have enough roads. And by road, we mean also trails and paths. But thankfully, with OSM, you can actually build this database yourself. And so you were asking with the youth, with local communities, and this is the beauty of working with open source data and software, is that you can really engage with people that you would not engage otherwise. And so going beyond collaboration, I guess, is contribution. And so we worked with the OSM local Madagascar community. We worked with our colleagues UN Mappers. And we organized this big campaign about mapping the road network of Vakinan-Karatra. So more than 900 people globally over a few weeks contributed to this data set. And now not only it's available to the ministry to run this algorithm on travel time and to improve it if they want, as they told us they were doing for the next school year, but the road network data stays. And so it means that humanitarians can use it and the first responders can use it in Madagascar. So like we're all building this collectively. And I think for us it was a really nice story because we really showed that data can be built and can be used. It's just a matter of, selecting the right mindset from the beginning.
Thank you very much, and being complementary is what I also hear here, and of course partnership, something that we didn't have the chance to dig into deeper, even though when we had a discussion before we wanted to. But I'm glad that we can actually now invite in our closing remarks in a minute, because I'm sure that Björn will also share with us a little bit this broader perspective, and also in a sense tackle the last question that we had. Also, what does this relate? How does this relate to the SDGs and the road to 2030? That's the title of our IDMC strategy. That's of course very much the purpose. I mean, whatever we do today and whatever we realize is happening in crisis context and in displacement situations today, of course, is a longer-term development concern. And if the SDGs, if we are to meet the SDGs, then this is very much, the prerequisite in a sense. So you mentioned the road networks, road to the SDGs. Björn, maybe that can be your cue to join us here and at the Lantern. We'll just stay here, I think, so as to not waste more time. Björn, as you probably all know, is the head of the JDC, the Joint Data Center, based in Copenhagen. And the JDC was set up in 2019 to also fill some of those significant data gaps that we didn't touch upon that much today, but that are very close also to our hearts at IDMC, and really about the socioeconomic impacts of displacement. But he'll really help us, in a sense, take a step back now out and broaden a little bit the reflections and link it, yes, to what are our aims with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also how can we really take now the next advances in filling the data gaps that we discussed today. Thank you very much, first of all, to the panel. Thank you. Maybe a quick clap. And over to you, Björn.
All right, thank you very much.
Can we have the mic?
Yeah, so I think we've all been, this is all new to us, sitting in a room together, and we've been together for 3 years, and I recognize that I'm standing between this room and lunch, so I'll try to do my best to keep your attention. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here. And let me start by going back to January 2020, because we organized the first research conference on the socioeconomic situation of forcibly displaced in Copenhagen. We did that together with Harvard, with Brown University, and the World Bank's research department, and importantly, the Journal of Development Economics. We had a call for papers, and I think there were some 130, 140 or so submissions. We held the conference for 3 days, and one of the big takeaways when we closed was that there were a lot of good papers on refugees. refugees, particularly in the MENA region, a lot in Europe, of course in Cox's Bazar, very, very few on internally displaced. We drew the conclusion from that and organized the second research conference in January this year, together with Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and again, the bank's research department. And we had it specifically focused on IDPs. And after 3 days of conversations, one of the conclusions was another under-researched area was on children. So the choice of topic of GRID, it hits the mark so well, and it's borne out by what also the research community feels and sees as a research gap. So congrats on the choice of topic and for getting us together today. So just very briefly, background on the World Bank, UNHCR, Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement. We're sort of the new kid on the block. There are 15 people based in Copenhagen. Half of the staff are UNHCR contracted and half are bank contracted. It's probably the closest collaboration that the World Bank has with any UN entity. The mandate is to dramatically increase the quality, quantity, and accessibility of data on forcibly displaced and the host communities. So as we all know, forced displacement numbers are growing dramatically year by year, and the war in Ukraine is significantly adding to that number. As I was preparing these remarks, the official statistics was 84 million forcibly displaced in the world. And then I opened my phone this morning and the High Commissioner has come out and said we are now above 100 million. So the challenge is growing, and the crisis that we're seeing in and around Ukraine is almost unprecedented in terms of scale and speed. But going back to the official figure of 84 million, I think the estimate is that about 35 million are under 18 or children. That's more than 1/3 of all displaced in the world. Displacement is very much a children's issue. And despite these alarmingly high levels, the data and evidence base, I think we would all agree here, on the socioeconomic situation of this group of people is severely limited. Significant shortage of both data and data-driven research compared to the scale and the magnitude that the challenge warrants. And I think, as we've heard from panel members during the discussion, we want to have decisions be evidence-driven. We know that you can only take a horse to the water, you can't make him drink, but at least I think it's our responsibilities as civil servants, as academics, to serve up the evidence and serve up the statistics, and it's very difficult for the moment to do that, given the limited data that we do have. I'm paraphrasing the UN Secretary General when he came to open the Joint Data Center in 2019. We cannot afford to do the wrong thing for the people that have so basic and dramatic needs. And that applies to adults as much as it does to children and youth. At the center, we believe that we can collectively, and let me emphasize that collectively, because anything we do in partnerships, we can dramatically improve the quality, quantity, and accessibility of data and evidence. And that can be achieved if we focus on what we have identified as 4 priorities. First, to strengthen standards and systems to ensure that we use the same statistical standards when we account for IDPs and refugees. Second, to create a step change in the amount of data analysis collected on forcibly displaced, including from the most difficult contexts, where IDPs often tend to be located. And third, to enhance data access so that the results of our data collection efforts are indeed shared with potential users of the information, and that we share that information responsibly. And finally, that we can build partnerships among stakeholders and treat the information that we gather as global public goods. I'm going to take a few minutes to go through these four in a little bit more detail. First, on systems and standards. As I hope most of you know, in 2020, in March, the UN Expert Group on Refugee and IDPs published the International Recommendations on IDP Statistics, also known as IRIS. These recommendations are for countries and international organizations to use to improve the production, overall quality, coordination and dissemination of statistics on IDPs. This is a big step forward, but now the recommendations need to be rolled out at the country level. It's nice that we have agreement in New York, but that's just a start. As we implement these recommendations, I want to highlight two aspects. First, the current invisibility of internally displaced children in global and national data is partially due to the low availability of timely age disaggregated data, as brought up by several during the morning here. As noted in the report, in the GRID report, which I think is a great piece, few, if any, data sets currently disaggregate in line with the recommendations. In fact, only 5% of the records that were collected in 2020, the report says, included some form of age disaggregation, and half of those were from Nigeria. Age disaggregation is necessary to understand the different needs in terms of protection, healthcare, education, and livelihoods. And the report notes that while an increasing number of data collectors gather and publish local level information disaggregated by sex and age, but age groups are not standardized, which makes it difficult to compile national level figures, let alone between countries. My second egress-related point is the importance of capacity building efforts to support national statistical offices in countries with IDPs. This will help improve the quality and the availability of IDP statistics, but importantly, capacity building is the only way to make our efforts sustainable over time. It's also critical that the data collected on IDPs meet the quality standards and needs of their users. Statistical data should be based on systematically applied definitions, international standards, and robust methodologies. For example, children born into displacement are in some countries as IDPs, while by strict definition they're not, as they themselves were not forced to leave their homes. EGRIS advises that these children should be counted as a separate IDP-related population. In line with this, it's important that we collect statistically rigorous data that is operationally relevant. And I really like that point that came out from this last the last panel here. What operationally relevant means for us is that it's useful for decision makers in governments, that it's useful for those who program big interventions or design projects. For the JDC, we have a picture of a state secretary in a large hosting country on our wall, together with the country director or the UNHCR representative in the particular countries. This has been really interesting in the case of Ukraine, as the teams from both UNHCR and the bank come to us and they say, how can we, what are the lessons learned from other areas, and how can you, and please share it in a way so I can absorb the information in 5 minutes and 10 minutes so I can take it to my daily operations. Second area on data collection analysis. It was really good to see during COVID how data collection methods, in the absence of opportunities to do face-to-face surveys, that the statistical community embraced innovation and generated insightful and useful evidence from phone surveys. The World Bank launched a really ambitious phone survey program to understand how the people in the Global South, for lack of a better word, were impacted during the pandemic. In the JDC, we piggybacked on that and supported an extension of these surveys so that they would also include forcibly displaced where relevant. And that extension and the subsequent oversampling to get statistically relevant results on IDPs and refugees included interviews with over 100,000 displaced households and people in host communities. Among the results from this work, specifically on IDP, we learned that in Burkina Faso and in Iraq, the pandemic aggravated food insecurity and food access for IDP households. In addition, educational engagement during the pandemic plummeted, with very small shares of children engaging in any learning activities during school closure. And worse, and as mentioned in the report, in the GRID report, for some children, the school interruption may have meant a point of no return to education. There are also lots of other innovation, and I think as William on the panel mentioned, the good work by Save the Children, including on using geospatial data. Another result from these phone surveys was on health. Of course, even prior to the pandemic, the health of IDP children was particularly vulnerable, as their unique health needs are often not addressed by general health service provision. In a quarterly digest that we published in March last year, which we did together with UNICEF's Innocenti Research Center, we identified that health risks are often exacerbated by poor sanitary conditions, poor nutritional status, and sexual exploitation, as well as by fragmented health service delivery in IDP camps. Related, the digest pulled together what is known about mental health of internally displaced in sub-Saharan Africa, and one of the conclusions was that the experience of violence resulted in post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety among IDP children. But coming back to the observation from the research conference that I talked about initially, we need more primary data collection in countries and settings with the biggest data gaps per reported size of the displacement situation. I often, when I hear the researchers presenting their work, especially for Western academic institutions, you have a little bit of a sense of the analogy with the drunken man. He looks for the key where the light is. Instead, we need a torch and to shine the light on those areas that are particularly in the statistical shadows, which is also most of the time where the needs are the greatest. We're fully aware of the costs and the risks of primary data collection in those contexts, but that's also where we can make collectively the biggest difference. During the conference, many countries in the Sahel came up as examples, the DRC came up, and the Sudan, just to name a few. In short, we feel that there's been a steady increase in the amount of data on IDPs and analysis, in part thanks to innovations, but much remains. My third point is on how we have to improve the accessibility of the data collected and the evidence produced. At the data center, we promote a responsible data access agenda. Coming into my current assignment 3 years ago, I was told that UNHCR has lots and lots of data, and that's wonderful. And you sort of, okay, so where are they? Oh, most of the time they sit on local servers, or they sit on individual laptops out in the areas in the displacement context. Why are you not sharing it? Well, because of the protection concerns, of course. Now, it's been interesting to be on this journey together with UNHCR, very much supported by the Director of International Protection in UNHCR, where she has really come out strongly and talked about the cost of not sharing data. But of course, protection or data on forcibly displaced is critically sensitive. You have to be very careful in how you do it, but there are ways to do it. In UNHCR, they've launched what they call a response. They've called a data, basically a data revolution internally, where they have created first a data curation team and cleaned and anonymized the existing data sets. They built a microdata library modeled on the World Bank's microdata library, and with a lot of support by the bank, and they've uploaded the data sets as they were anonymized and cleaned. That library now houses some 430 data sets, and they're all accessible to anyone with the necessary credentials. And I want to throw it out there. Are the organizations that you represent, are they on this journey of sharing the data that you have? I was pleased to hear the question from a colleague from ICRC, with whom we're working quite closely to see how we can support a greater data access of the information that they have. The fourth is on partnerships, and making use of the existing evidence. We feel that we need to attract more researchers that focus on displacement challenges generally, to provide the evidence base and the insights on how displacement affects children's education, health, security, housing, and future livelihoods. There are really positive signs that the research community is indeed improving and stepping up to this challenge, including and particularly among those who rely on quantitative methods. In a recent paper published late last year, produced by a professor at Bristol and a colleague at the center, they presented empirical evidence that there's been an exponential growth over the past 5 to 10 years of outputs academic output offering evidence on displacement by economists, political scientists, data scientists, and other quantitatively oriented social scientists. Ted Miguel of UC Berkeley called it an explosion, and this is great news. He also made a point in the research conference saying how much easier it has been for him and for his colleagues to access data from, I think he was speaking specifically on UNHCR, but more widely also. It's great to have academic papers, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages long, maybe even books, but you need to get that information into the hands of the people who make decisions. Our contribution to that effort to make the information accessible is to every month summarize the best articles and put them up in a library. I think we have currently summarized some 460 of the most relevant research papers and reports, focusing on socioeconomic situation, carefully curated and diligently cataloged geographically, sectorally, and thematically. Please have a look and make sure you consult the existing work before you embark on new, so that we build on each other. Let me point out my contribution to the research gap question. Two things. Great need for more bespoke research on internal displacement while keeping IDPs in mind when pursuing research questions. Bridging the gap between academic research and policymakers can be supported by formulating policy advice and pushing it in the hands of practitioners. A good example is from Colombia, where civil society organizations, governments, and research institutions jointly help to illustrate the extent of the internal displacement and the needs of IDPs in Colombia. Second, the gap is in many protracted displaced situations in the world, such as, for example, in Eastern DRC, we need to move beyond humanitarian aid to development initiatives that offer IDPs return home, local integration, or resettlement elsewhere. As pointed out last year in an approach paper by the World Bank called Development Approach to Conflict-Induced Internal Displacement, it was noted that while the current international IDP framework is crucial for ensuring protection and assistance, it often falls short in terms of providing medium-term approaches. A medium-term approach requires further investments in socioeconomic studies of IDPs and their hosts, as well as seeing their development needs as just one share of those for the entire country. A development response aims to enable IDPs to benefit from the same opportunities as non-displaced while keeping a strong focus on host communities and local authorities. So to sum up, just 3 takeaways, or maybe 4. We don't only need data, but we need statistically rigorous data that is operationally relevant. 2, further investments in innovative data collections which present new opportunities to improve data availability using phone surveys, using geospatial tools also for collecting socioeconomic data. 3, to improve the availability and accessibility of high quality socioeconomic data and evidence, working towards a data access agenda. And 4th, to continue, and I think you're doing a great job here, to build a community to include host governments, international organizations, civil society, and the academic community. The scope of the challenge that we confront is unfortunately growing, and hence we need to step up our efforts even more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Björn. And thanks for closing us off so ably now. And there's nothing anymore that stands between you and lunch after these wise words. So please, maybe Alexandra, our director, can take the lead and we follow you. Thank you very much. And we will reconvene in the room next to this one, the bigger room there, for the afternoon session. Thank you.